Hi everyone, PV here and welcome to today's YouTube video. And today we're going to review every single red card from Innistrad Cursive. So if you missed out the previous set of reviews, make sure to check out the links in the description. We've already done white, blue, and black. Now we're going to do red, green, and golden artifact this week. But if you've missed them, the way it works is we're going to go through every single card in this set, and I'll talk about what I think the possible applications of the card are, mostly for Constructed, specifically standard and historic, but if I think it's particularly interesting for another format, I'll also talk about that. But it's a Constructed focused review, so we're going to speed through the cards that are not Constructed playable pretty quickly. So let's start with the red cards, and the first red card is a Braid. Now a Braid is a card that saw a lot of play before, so people might be overrating it a little bit this time around, because right now we have good 2-mana removal spells, right? We have Cathartic Pyre that has an upside, we have the Dragon's Fire that has an upside as well, so we're not lacking for 2-mana instant speed 3 damage removal spells, right? We have plenty of those that we're already not playing. So if you want to play a Braid, you really have to be destroying artifacts. And I think in Standard right now, the only artifact I really want to destroy is Esika's Chariot, right? I think that's the only one, and you're not doing it at a profit. They get 2/2/2s, but it's better to destroy the card than to just flat out lose to it, right? But I don't know, it just doesn't strike me as enough to make Braid have an upside over the other options that you have. And if you want to be destroying artifacts, you can just play Prismatic Command, right? If you are the blue-red colors. So I don't think our Braid is going to see a lot of play right now, at least at this point in time, right? It is a card that is always good to have in Standard because it's a super good catch-all answer, right? Especially if you play best of one. It is nice to be able to have this artifact removal for, any incidental artifacts, like Dollhouse of Horrors, for example. If that card turns up to be very good, if it's not to be very good, then you want to have access to a Braid, right? But I'm not going to be putting a Braid in my decks right now. Alchemist Gambit. This card is also, I think, pretty overrated because people remember the two last Time Walk effects that were both pretty broken, right? Auron's Epiphany and Nexus of Fate. And Time Warp was even banned in Historic after being introduced in Historic. So we've had a sequence of 3 very powerful Time Warp effects that makes people think that gaining extra turns is an ability that is just broken, that you cannot print. But I think in this case, it's not actually that good. We've had this type of card before, and they weren't that good. The circumstances right now are on making these effects powerful. For example, Nexus of Fate, you just shuffle yourself back. It's an instant, right? So it's just incredibly powerful when different. It's a win condition by itself, right? So it's very different than just taking an extra turn. The Auron's Epiphany creates 2 tokens, so it's also a win condition, and it has Foretell, which makes it cheaper, and also makes it dodge discard spells. Right, and Time Warp was just very good with the Dragon Fellow matches, specifically. So I think this card as a 7-mana Time Walk is not good. You don't want this effect. For you to want to play Alchemist Gambit, you have to be playing the 3-mana effect. And I think that can be done with stuff like Gideon, maybe, of the Trials in Historic. This is the main application for this card. I don't think the main application is just another Time Walk in the Epiphany decks, because I think the decks are happy with Epiphany already. Ancestral Anger. I think this card is actually quite reasonable. There are a bunch of decks that have played stuff like Crush Through, and other 1-mana red cantrips just because they want a spell that cantrips for 1 red mana, and this is that, but it actually does something else, right? It gives the creature power, and it gives it trample, the same as Crush Through. But if you have more Ancestral Angers, which is likely because you're playing a deck that, wants to churn through this card, you have a lot of cantrips, you have some self-mill potentially, you might get, 2 or 3 power off of this card, and that plus cycling can actually be pretty strong. The downside is that you have to have a creature in play, right? You can't just turn 1 cycle Crush Through, and if they kill your creature in response, you don't draw a card. So there are downsides to it, but I think this card is a card that is a bit of a slippery in the sense that no one's saying literally anything about it, and it could see play. I think there's a chance that this is play. I don't know exactly where, but this is an effect that I'm going to keep in mind. Bludgeoned Guest. I think this is just a limited card, as is Blood Hypnotist and Blood Paddle Celebrant. And Bloody Betrayal. I mean, Bloody Betrayal is a threaten. We've had threaten effects before that were good. They usually don't cost 3, though, but, it is a reasonable threaten if you're in the market for that. A Cemetery Gatekeeper. This one is pretty interesting because, again, we've been through this with the white card, right? It's not obvious what this does at first glance. If you read it, you could interpret it that if you get, they always take damage by playing a land, then and you, right? It's symmetrical, so you both take damage. Or you could interpret that this only happens if you exile a land. I think it's impossible to understand what this card does if you don't know it. And the actual effect is that you have to exile a land for it to deal damage when they play a land, right? And I think this makes it a little bit worse, but still potentially playable, especially in older formats when you have fetch lands, right? When you go just turn 2, you can sack a fetch land and play this and exile the fetch land, and you get a 2-mana Zozu, and that can be relatively powerful. Or if they're playing a specific deck, you might get instant or sorcery, and then you will actually deal a ton of damage to them the same way as an Eidolon of the Great Revels. So it's sort of a mix between the Eidolon and the Zozu, and I think this card is potentially good enough to see Constructed play in older formats just because enabling it with fetch lands is so easy. In Standard, it's pretty hard to get a land in the graveyard, especially because you don't have Fable Passage anymore, so you'd have to be playing turn worth expense to get this in play on turn 2 and in-gal a land. So you're usually looking at exiling instants, I think, against decks like, is it instant or sorcery, but mostly instant. And it's not an unreasonable card, especially because they will be take damage and you won't because you're not going to have a ton of instants. Right, so it works in multiples. I think it can be okay. The problem is that obviously it's a 2-drop, so you want to play it on turn 2, and you're usually not going to have a target by turn 2, right? Unless you play something yourself, like you shock them at the end of the turn, then you play this and get instant. It's just not going to work. So it's tricky, I think. It's a 2-mana card that you want to play early because you want to, start burning them early on. You don't want to let them play all their lands, and then, all their lands or all their instants, and then you play this, right? So you want the effect to happen sooner rather than later in the game, but you also don't have any ways of enabling it, right? So it's tricky, but could see play, I think. But I think it actually has a better chance of see playing in older formats because of fetch lands specifically. Also, keep in mind that unlike Zozu, this doesn't trigger twice off of fetch lands, right? Because they're just playing one land. Let me actually check Zozu. Yeah, Zozu just when a land enters the battlefield, so it will trigger, when they play a fetch land, it will trigger twice, right? This will only trigger once, but I think it's still pretty good if you can get it to trigger starting on turn 2. So, Chandra Dress to Kill. Pretty hard to evaluate. I think if you want to play Chandra Dress to Kill, you basically have to be playing a mono red deck, or at least a very, very heavy red deck. And that deck doesn't truly exist right now. It might, but it's tricky. Like usually these decks that want the plus don't want the mana, and it's kind of tricky. I can see the same play in a mono red deck, especially in the sideboard because it's a planeswalker, it's a threat. It lets you play a bunch of stuff. But unfortunately, it doesn't work on lands, so I think it's reasonable, basically. It's not nearly as good as the other Chandra, Torch of Defiance. That one is a lot more threatening. But it is also, like, I guess if you're playing as control, it is a potential threat, right? You play this, and you start going up, up, up. You deal some damage to them. You sometimes draw extra cards, and you'll threaten the ultimate, right? So I think in a mono-red deck, this card is probably going to be at least a good sideboard choice. Change of Fortune. It's pretty interesting, especially if you can chain them, right? If you play 2 of them, it's going to be really, really strong. But it's just so expensive. I think it's a pretty cool effect that might just not have a home by being so expensive. Like, you can play it with the cycling card, what is it called? The New Perspectives, right? In Historic. But you already have the Shadows of the Grave or whatever that does the same thing for 2 mana, right? If you're discarding your cards for free, it doesn't matter that you discard your hand. So if you want more of that effect, you can play, but costing 4 instead of 2 is a lot. A Creepy Puppeteer. It can be a lot of damage if you're turning a 1-1 into a 4-3, right? You're actually getting 7 damage out of the deal, which is pretty strong. But having to attack with exactly one other creature makes it pretty hard to trigger in general. I think this card is better than it looks, because 4 mana 4-3 haste is already a card that might see some play in some scenarios, but overall I think this is probably not going to be good enough. Cursive Hospitality. I think this is mostly a commander card because you want everyone to attack that player and you give benefits and whatnot. And so it's like a politics multiplayer kind of card. At least that seems to be the main intention. But I mean, you are getting a Coastal Piracy ish for 3 mana. So it might not be the worst deal ever, right? It's obviously not exactly Coastal Piracy. It's a little bit different. You only get to play the card that turn, right? So it's probably not good enough. But it is interesting, but probably not good enough. Daybreak Combatants, just limit the card. Dominating Vampire. I think there are better vampires that cost 3, right? You're better off playing the Florian, I think, is a better vampire. I think the 3/1 that works with blood tokens, that you sack 2 blood tokens to come back, is probably a better 3-mana vampire. And then there's also Graveyard Trespasser, and there's also the Werewolf that gives haste. So the 3-drop is kind of clutter for vampire decks already. And this requires a lot of vampires to be good. If you have a lot of vampires in play, it is going to be good. Right, and it's worth mentioning that if you have 3 vampires, you can give itself haste, so you can do 3 haste for 3. But overall, I don't think this has a place in the vampire decks. I feel like the 3-mana options are better elsewhere. And the festivities. I mean, if you want to sweep, if you want a 1-mana deal 1 damage to everything card, this is going to be reasonable for you, right? This type of card has been played before. Normally you would rather play something like Cinderclass, but if you are yourself playing 1-mana creatures, or sorry, 1 toughness creatures, then this will dodge that. So that's the upside. So that's potentially a good sideboard card in the right format. Falconrat Salabrands. Name the card. Flame Blast Bolt. This card is good. Right, it is basically Magma Spray, right? Which does see play already. And it deals with Planeswalkers as well, so it's upgraded Magma Spray in this regard. So it is almost certainly going to see some play in Historic, and it might see play in Standard as well, depending on what the format looks like. Right now, I would rather play with Fire, right? I don't think there are enough graveyard synergies to justify playing this instead of Play with Fire. But if you are interested in exiling Arclight Phoenix, for example, then the Exile Clause could just matter, and you'd play this instead of Magma Spray because it's just better. Frenzied Devils. Cool fact, but 5 mana is just so much for a 3/3 haste, right? You can grow pretty quickly, but it's still not good enough. Honeymoon Hearse. Hearse. I don't know how to pronounce that. I don't know what this word even means. Yeah, this is just, I don't think, very good. 3 mana 5/5 trample. You have to tap 2 creatures to activate. You're just losing out on too much. Hungry Ridge Wolf. I mean, I think this is mostly a limited card, but if you're really desperate for Werewolves 2-drops, it does become a 3/2 pretty reliably. I don't think we are that desperate, though. Into the Night. This is very similar to the other card that we just saw, the Change of Fortune, right? It's also a new TV show on Netflix that I actually like. It's a Belgian show, and they ran away from the sun. But anyway... yeah, probably not good enough for constructors to limit the card. The other one is better. The one we already have, the Natural Moonrise. So I think you'd better play that than Into the Night. Cassette Flame Breather. I think this card is actually okay. Obviously, we have Thermal Alchemist, which is a better version of that, right? But if your deck wants the Thermal Alchemist, it probably also wants this, because they sort of do the same thing. The other one is a better version of it. But like, if you're going all the way that you will play that, you'll probably want to play this one as well. I don't think there is a deck that plays those right now, but it's interesting to keep in mind. Cassette Wolf Rider. I think this card is pretty good. 1 mana, 1/2 menace means it gets to attack for 1 a lot in the early game. It's not actually that easy to block. Right, so the haste creatures, usually they get in a couple points of damage, then your opponent plays a blocker, then they don't get in any more damage. And this will not get in the first point of damage, but it will get in the other points of damage when they only have 1 blocker, or they have to keep 2 creatures black just to block it. Alright, so I think Menace on a 1-drop is better than it looks, and the effect can be quite strong. You can use it at instant speed. Right, having 3 cards in your graveyard is not that easy, so especially if you're playing this mono-red deck, but it does happen. And sometimes it will happen multiple times in the game. So you're just getting this really, really good free effect, right? You would not play 1/2 manas for 1, right? It's not good enough for that. But if you activate the effect once per game, that's pretty good, later in the game. And sometimes you'll do it twice or 3 times. Like we've seen it happen with Ox of Agonas, for example, or the Phoenix.
right? It is just getting a free 3/2 is pretty relevant. So I think this card is quite good. If there is an aggro red deck, I think it's going to see play. It also creates wolves, but it's not a wolf itself, which is weird because the wolf is really indefinite in the picture, so you'd really think it's a wolf, but it's not. It's a human knight. But it does create wolves, so if you have those synergies, you're interested in that, it can be good. Lacerate Flash, limit a card. Lightning Wolf, limit a card as well. Magma Pummeler, honestly, there's no way to know what this does. This text is so big. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 on counters. If damage will be dealt to it, you remove it, and then deals with it. No, not good enough. Mana from Hellkite. This one is actually good, I think. So the way this works is, basically, it's a 4 mana 4/4 flying card, right? Which is not a novelty. We've had plenty of those recently. 4 mana 4/4 flying dragon. But when you play a spell, which is not a creature, right? But it doesn't have to be an instant or sorcery. It can be Aztec's Chariot or Red and 7 or something like that. You make an XX that attacks for 1 turn, basically. So you play Aztec's Chariot, you get a free 4/4 flyer with haste that will die at the end of the turn. You get the X is the cost of the spell. So if you play Red and 7, you're getting a free 5/5 to attack with. So it's a pretty good curve, right? You go turn 4 this, turn 5 Red and 7, and you get to attack for a lot. Right, for 9 with this card specifically, so that's pretty strong. And if you can play X spells, right? The new X spell with flashback is actually kind of reasonable. So you get to create a gigantic XX dragon. So this card I think is pretty good. I don't know what the home is. I don't know if it's better than the other dragons you can play in something like Genuine Alder Pros Teamwork deck, right? But it is an interesting card to keep in mind. It does attack for a lot of damage, potentially, if you have these more expensive spells. Murkov Retribution. Probably not good enough. 3 mana sorcery. Yeah. Oliva's Attendant. If you were in the market for blood tokens, this creates a lot of blood tokens, but I don't think 6 mana for a 6/6 menace is cutting it in today's standard formats. Power Spawn, limited card. Reckless Impulse. I think this one is better than it looks. Because if you hit a land and a spell that costs less than 3, you get to cast both the spells, right, next turn for sure. So it's similar to Light Up the Stage, except it costs 2 instead of 1 or 3. I think Light Up the Stage was better if you were an aggro deck, because it was so easy to just trigger it on turns 2 and 3 and find, a second land, or find a card that you can play alongside the Light Up the Stage on turn 2, when you have, an extra mana. So it was easier to get to play both your cards with the Light Up the Stage. But this is obviously better in a control deck, right? Because you're not triggering the spectacle on Light Up the Stage very much. And Light Up the Stage was a very good card. So there might be room for a card to be worse than that and still be good. Obviously, you don't want to be the super reactive control deck, right? You don't want to play this and exile a Dissipate, right? That just doesn't work. But if you're exiling a land and another spell that you can cast on turn 3, then it's going to be good. So I think this card has a chance of seeing play. It might even see play in older formats. In storm decks that don't want to run blue. I think it's a reasonable card drawing spell in red. So I think this card is potentially pretty good. Rending Flame. 3 mana, 5 damage. If you're interested in dealing 5 damage for 3 mana, you're going to play this. There are usually better options. I think right now there's one that makes something lose indestructible that has in play. So it's mostly going to be a sideboard card if a red deck needs to kill specifically 5 toughness creatures. Runebound Wolf. I think this card is pretty interesting because it does win the game on a stalled battlefield, right? If you are going to have some wolves, and then in 2 turns they take 8 damage, and that's pretty strong, but it is a 2/2 for 2, right? So you really have to be in the market for that effect. I wouldn't count it out, though. I think, if you are in a spot where games are stalling out a lot, then this is going to break any stalls, right? It's going to win you the game through the stalls. So there are probably better options for that if you go later in the curve, right? There are like 5 or 6 drops that win you the game in those stalls anyway. But this is a 2-drop, right? It's probably not good enough. It's just wishful thinking for this mythical wolves and werewolves deck. But I wouldn't rule it out completely, but it's probably not good enough. Sanguine Statuette. If there are a lot of rafts, then I think this can be good. Right, it has to both have to be true. There have to be a lot of sorcery speed sweepers so that this will dodge them, and you have to have a lot of blood tokens because by itself it just attacks once, right? You need to generate other blood tokens for it to attack. So it's probably not good enough. I don't think this confluence of we're not playing a sweeper format right now is the reality of it. I think people aren't playing just Doom Scars and a bunch of blood in his nose type of stuff. they are mostly playing just 1-for-1 removal spells and, you know, bounce and stuff to buy time. So I don't think this is good enough to play. Stanza Uprising. This is pretty interesting. I mean, you get a 1-1 every turn, right? That's already a cool effect. And if you're getting a 1-1 every turn, at some point you get to 13 permanents, and you can dump them for 7 or kill a creature, right? So I'm not going to rule it out because of the 1-1 every turn. It's interesting. I have no idea where I would play. I wouldn't play it anywhere right now, but it's an interesting card to keep in mind, right? A lot of these red cards, I think, are interesting cards to keep in mind. I don't know where I'd play them exactly, but I'm happy that they exist, and I'll keep them in mind because there might be a deck for them in the future. But they don't fit in any traditional deck that exists right now. And I think a theme with this set in general is that the decks that were good got better, right? Like Mono White got Thalia, the blue-red deck got a better card drawing spell, it got good cyber cards, it got a land, Mono Green deck got a 1-drop. So the good decks will improved. So it's going to be tricky for a deck that wasn't good before to get there, I think. And the decks are super strong. So this might not be the moment for a card like this, but I will be keeping it in mind. Sure Strike, this card is just not good at all. Vampire's Vengeance. This card is actually pretty reasonable if there is a vampire deck in the format, right? It is, you have the option of playing Crippling Fear. Sure, vampires are usually black-red, so you have the option of playing Crippling Fear, but mostly this is instant and you get a blood token. So if you're trying to kill 2 toughness creatures anyway, this is a much better deal, right? It's cheaper, instant, and you get a blood token. Control decks will probably want other options because they won't want to risk playing this against a deck with vampires, right? You would rather just have Cinderclasm and don't not get your blood token, but be reliable and have the option of casting it for 2. But if you're specifically playing a vampire deck, then I think this can be a good choice, as long as you're trying to kill 2 toughness creatures, not 3 toughness creatures, because if you need to kill 3 toughness creatures, then you have to play Crippling Fear instead. Voldaren Epicure. I think this card is reasonable. It might not be worth a card, but it's effectively a 1-1 better haste, right? Because it just deals the damage, they can't block. It will enable any of the, if you've dealt damage this turn, tap cards, right? And you create a blood token, which is can be pretty good if you have the right deck for it. I don't know if it's worth the slot, because there are not that many vampire synergies right now, so you're not getting that much out of having an extra vampire. But it might be. It's definitely a card I'm going to try in the black-red vampire deck. I think it has the potential to be pretty strong, and it can also be good if you're lacking 1-drops in just a mono-red aggro type of deck, right? Just as a 1-1 better haste with another effect that stops flooding or it fixes your draws a little bit. So I think this card is pretty interesting. Now the double-face cards. The double-face cards are in a different sheet on the WotC website, so they are not in the alphabetical order. But Alluring Suitor. I think this is not good enough. Like, it's pretty hard to trigger, and there are a lot of good 3s already in red, so I'm not very interested in it. Ballista Watcher, I think this is just a limited card. Fearful Villager, also limited card. Ill-Tempered Loner. This one might not be strictly a limited card, just because, you know, it reminds me of Boros Reckoner, which was a card that was very, very good in Standard. But it costs 3, right? This costs 4, which is a lot more than 3. But it does have a pump ability, so it's pretty threatening. And it has the backside, right? If they don't do anything, or if it's already night, then it turns on the effect on every creature you have. So all of a sudden, if you just Alpha Strike, they're gonna die, right? Because they either take the damage or they block and take a lot of damage too. So, or you could just kill all their creatures. So I think this card is actually interesting for a werewolf deck, the Ill-Tempered Loner. It doesn't even have to be a werewolf deck, right? It by itself, if they pass a turn, you already flip, or you can pass a turn to flip it. I think this card is one card to keep in mind. I don't know where I would play it, but I think it's an interesting card. Lemho Raconteur. I think this just costs too much. Obviously, on the flip side, like, it can be quite strong. You just chain a bunch of spells, and they die, basically. But you want this type of card to be cheaper, I think, because you don't want to be holding your spells until it flips. It's kind of tricky there. It becomes a Gutter's Knight, and that's just not that good. Volatile Arsonist. I think this card could be good if it wasn't for Goldspan Dragon. As it is, Goldspan Dragon is just a better 5-drop most of the time. Like, you have to really have a lot of werewolf synergies and not have a lot of things to do with the mana for this card to be better. If you can play it on the backside I mean, it is pretty strong. It gets to attack for 7. It's not that easy to block. But flying is usually better than Menace in general. And creating tokens is just better than dealing the damage. But, I mean, if you are attacking and killing a creature and dealing extra damage, it can be strong. So I'm not going to rule this out again. I think this has potential. It is fighting with Goldspan Dragon, though, and I think most decks would prefer Goldspan Dragon. It might be specifically the Werewolf deck that will already, like, that has a high chance of playing this when it's already night, so that it becomes a 5/5 attacks for 7 that is interested in this card. Voltaic Visionary. Voltaic Visionary is interesting. It's not that hard to flip. So it's a 2-mana 3/1 in red, which is, bad, but doable. And then you take 2 to draw a card, basically, but you have to play that turn. But it can be a land, so it's not that hard to do. And then when you do play it, you flip it, and it's a 4/3 can't block. So 4/3 can't block for 2 is reasonable, right? It might even be a pretty good card in a red deck, I think. 4 is a lot of damage for a 2-drop. So, and this card has a lot of layers to it. Right, it would obviously be better if you don't tap the good attack immediately, but that would be kind of broken. But if you're playing versus a control deck, you don't have to flip it, right? If the board is stalled, you can't attack with your 4/3 anyway, then you don't flip it. You take 2 damage, exile the top card. Is it good? Then you play and you flip it, right? But if it's bad, you just leave it there. You don't activate it. So you don't flip it, and you get to do the ability again. So if you're digging for something specific, right, if they are on 2 life and you're trying to find a burn spell, you just dig an extra card per turn for that burn spell, which can be pretty reasonable. But I think mostly the play pattern is that you're going to be wanting to flip this as soon as possible, so you get an extra card out of it, and you get your 4/3. But worst case scenario, you get to attack with a 3/1 anyway, right, which is not that small. So I think this card is interesting. Mono red decks might want this as their 2-drop, I think. Wary Prisoner. This is just a limp deck card. So red. Red, I think, is a pretty interesting color in the sense that it has a lot of cards that are potentially good for a deck that is not good right now, which is mono red aggro, right? It has, for example, I think Voltaic Visionary can be pretty good in the right red aggro deck. And I think the wolf that makes, not the wolf, the human that makes wolves when you exile 3 cards is also pretty interesting in the right deck, and maybe even the Epicure, right? But that deck is just not good right now. Which is a bit of a problem, right, for their red cards in this file. There are some vampires that are good, but I think mostly the vampires, the good vampires are in black or black-red. They're not strictly mono-red. So I think the card that is probably the best for standard in this format, in this set, is the Hellkite, the Mana Form Hellkite. Because that is a card that I can see slotting into a deck that currently exists, right? Which is the Gruul / Timur deck. But you also have Reckless Impulse, which can be good in older formats even. And then a bunch of mono red cards, as I mentioned. And Vampire's Vengeance, which can be a good cyber card for vampires. So there's a lot of potential playables in red here. And if we have a mono red deck in the future, right now we don't, right? Right now there's no mono red deck. But if you have a mono red deck soon, then we might come back to Crimson Vow and revisit the red cards because there are a lot of potentially good options there for that style of deck. If you like my work and want to support me a little bit more, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR, and there you can support my work and get some extra perks on top of it, such as access to an exclusive Discord server where you can ask questions, talk to me, vote on topics for the next videos, and stuff like that. And special thank you for my biggest supporters. Adam Renzi, Adam Camilleri, Clicks, Foxy, Fernando Vizeu, John Jam, Jack Hart, Joey, Calvin Peng, Kevin Masse, Lawson, Mattia Giardini, Nate, Safa Rappin, Silvia Letizia, Stu Cameron, Thomas Pokorny, Dimitri, and Willie Linton. I really appreciate the support, and I'll see you next video.